The bitter December wind howled through the cracks of Mary Sullivan's cabin like a vengeful spirit, jolting her awake before dawn. Her breath formed tiny clouds in the frigid air as she pulled the threadbare blankets tighter around her trembling body. This was her first winter alone in Colorado Territory, 1878, and the merciless cold seemed determined to break her spirit just as surely as it had frozen the creek behind her property. Mary had arrived in Summit Springs just 7 months earlier, a 22-year-old widow with nothing but a trunk of belongings and the deed to a small plot of land her late husband had purchased before typhoid took him. The locals had warned her about the harsh winter, but warnings couldn't prepare her for the bone-deep chill that had settled into the cabin's very walls. She forced herself to rise, her feet recoiling as they touched the ice-cold wooden floor. The fire had died hours ago, and the prospect of venturing outside for more wood made her stomach clench. Just as she was about to brave the elements, a soft knock sounded at her door. Mary grabbed her shawl, wrapping it around her nightdress as she approached cautiously. "Who's there?" She called, voice still rough with sleep. "Preston Mills, madam. I've brought some firewood." Mary opened the door just enough to peer out. The tall cowboy stood on her porch, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, arms loaded with split logs. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but she could see a gentle smile beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "Mr. Mills?" she questioned. She recognized him vaguely from town, though they'd never formally met. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Rode by yesterday evening. Noticed your woodpile was getting low." He shifted the weight in his arms. "Thought you might need these come morning." Mary hesitated only a moment before opening the door wider. "That's uncommonly kind of you." He entered with a nod, moving directly to the stone fireplace. "Winter's no time to be short on wood in these parts, Mrs. Sullivan." His hands worked quickly, arranging kindling and logs with practiced ease. Within minutes, flames danced in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the sparse cabin. Preston stood, dusting his hands on his worn denim pants. "I'll bring more tomorrow," he said simply, already moving toward the door. "Should keep you warm until then." Before Mary could properly thank him, he was gone, leaving only boot prints in the snow and the blessed warmth of the fire behind. She stood by the hearth, fingers outstretched toward the flames, wondering about the quiet cowboy who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. True to his word, Preston returned the next morning and the morning after that. Each day he arrived before dawn with an armload of wood, built her fire, and departed with few words exchanged between them. On the 5th day, Mary was ready. "I've made coffee," she said as he finished stacking the logs, "and some cornbread, the least I can do to thank you." Preston paused, seeming to weigh his response. "Don't want to impose, madam." "It's not an imposition when I'm offering," Mary replied, already pouring the steaming coffee into a chipped cup. "Besides, I'd welcome the company. It gets mighty quiet out here." Something in her words seemed to reach him. He removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, and sat at her small table. "You're a long way from neighbors," he commented, accepting the coffee. "Not many women would brave these winters alone." Mary sat across from him, warming her hands on her own cup. "Not many women find themselves with much choice in the matter," she offered a small smile. "My husband James died last spring, shortly after purchasing this land. We were meant to come west together." Preston's eyes, a deep, clear blue she hadn't noticed before, held genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Sullivan." "Mary," she corrected gently, "and thank you. For your condolences and for the firewood, I must admit, I wasn't prepared for how quickly the cold sets in here." "Colorado winters don't give much warning," Preston agreed. "Been here 8 years now, and every November they still catch me by surprise." Their conversation continued easily, touching on Preston's work at the Walker Cattle Ranch to the north and Mary's plans to plant vegetables come spring. When he finally rose to leave, the sun had fully risen, bathing the snow-covered landscape in golden light. "I should get to my chores," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Mr. Walker doesn't take kindly to tardiness." Mary walked him to the door. "Thank you again, Mr. Mills." "Preston," he corrected with the hint of a smile. "And you're welcome, Mary." As the days passed and December deepened, these morning visits became a ritual. Preston would bring wood, build her fire, and they would share coffee and conversation before he headed to the ranch. Mary began to anticipate these quiet moments, finding herself preparing special treats, apple preserves or honey-sweetened porridge to share during his visits. She learned that Preston had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, seeking open spaces after years in the infantry. He spoke little of those times but mentioned a younger brother lost at Gettysburg and parents who had passed before he turned 20. Like her, he stood alone in the world. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked one morning as they watched the sunrise through her small window. "Living on your own, I mean," Preston considered her question. "Used to it now, I suppose. The mountains and the horses are company enough most days." He glanced at her, "but winter nights can stretch long sometimes." Mary nodded, understanding all too well the ache of solitude that seemed to expand in the darkness on Christmas Eve. Preston arrived with not only wood, but also a small pine tree lashed to his horse. "Thought you might like something festive," he explained somewhat awkwardly as he propped it in the corner of her cabin. Mary's eyes brightened with unexpected tears. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching a fragrant branch. "I didn't think I'd have a Christmas tree this year." Together, they decorated the small tree with strings of dried berries Mary had preserved and paper stars they cut from old newspaper. Preston produced a small, carved wooden angel from his pocket for the top, a surprisingly delicate piece for such large, work-roughened hands. "Did you make this?" Mary asked, admiring the simple beauty of the carving. Preston nodded, a flush visible beneath his beard. "Keeps my hands busy on cold nights." That evening, Preston stayed longer than usual. They shared a modest feast of rabbit stew and the last of Mary's precious store-bought sugar cookies. As darkness fell, he reluctantly rose to leave. "The ranch hands are having a Christmas gathering tonight," he explained. "Should make an appearance." At the door, Mary impulsively reached for his hand. "Thank you for making this Christmas less lonely, Preston." His fingers closed gently around hers, and for a moment they stood connected by more than touch. "Merry Christmas, Mary," he said softly, before disappearing into the gathering darkness. The next morning, Christmas Day, Mary woke to the familiar sound of Preston's knock. She opened the door to find him holding not only wood but also a carefully wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," he said, handing her the gift after setting down the logs. Inside the brown paper was a beautifully carved wooden box with delicate wildflowers etched across the lid. "For letters and keepsakes," Preston explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "Not much, but it's beautiful," Mary interrupted, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "I've never received anything so thoughtful." She hesitated, then moved to the cabinet beside her bed. "I have something for you too, though it seems inadequate now." She handed him a carefully knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "I noticed your old one was rather worn," she explained. Preston accepted it reverently, as though she'd given him gold instead of simple yarn. "No one's made me anything in a very long time," he said, wrapping it around his neck. "Thank you, Mary." That Christmas marked a shift in their relationship. Preston still came every morning with wood, but now he often returned in the evenings when his work allowed. Sometimes he brought game rabbits or a grouse, and they would prepare dinner together. Other nights, he simply sat by her fire, carving while she mended or read aloud from her small collection of books. January brought the harshest weather yet. For 3 days, a blizzard raged, making travel impossible. Mary worried about Preston, hoping he was safely sheltered at the ranch. On the 4th morning, when the storm finally broke, she heard the familiar sound of hooves trudging through deep snow. She rushed to the door to find Preston, his horse struggling through drifts nearly to its chest. His face was red with cold beneath his frost-covered beard. "You shouldn't have come," she called, hurrying to help him with the wood. "It's too dangerous in these conditions." "Promised you wouldn't wake cold," he replied simply, his voice rough from the bitter air. "Couldn't break my word." Mary pulled him inside, alarmed by how severely he shivered. "You're half frozen," she admonished, pushing him toward the fire and helping remove his ice-encrusted coat. What good is warm wood to me if you catch your death bringing it? Preston allowed her fussing, a small smile playing at his lips despite his obvious discomfort. Worried about me, Mary? Of course I'm worried, she replied, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. You've become. She paused, suddenly aware of the weight of what she was about to say. Important to me, his eyes, so startlingly blue against his wind-burned face, held hers. Have I now? Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fireplace. You know you have, she said softly. Preston set down his cup and reached for her hand, enfolding it in his much larger one. You should know that I don't just come here out of concern for your firewood situation. Why do you come then? She asked, though something in her already knew the answer. Because since the first morning I saw you standing in this doorway with your hair all tumbled from sleep and your eyes full of that stubborn determination that won't let this place beat you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've found I can't stay away, don't want to stay away. Mary's heart hammered in her chest. I look forward to your knock every morning, she admitted. The days feel empty when you leave. Preston's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. I've been alone a long time, Mary, thought that's just how my life would be, but now. She prompted when he fell silent. Now I find myself thinking that maybe there could be more, for both of us. Mary stepped closer, summoning courage she hadn't known she possessed. I think there could be. Preston's free hand came up to gently touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. When he leaned down to kiss her, it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. His lips were warm and tender, asking rather than demanding, and Mary responded with all the longing that had been building in her heart. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I should go, he whispered, though he made no move to leave. The ranch, stay, Mary said, surprising herself with her boldness. Just for today, the trails are barely passable and the ranch will understand. Stay with me. And so he did. They spent the day in the warm cocoon of her small cabin, talking and sharing stories they'd never told another soul. Preston spoke of the war's horrors and the nightmares that still sometimes haunted him. Mary confessed her fears of failing at this new life and the guilt she carried for not loving her first husband as deeply as she perhaps should have. James was kind, she explained as they sat close on her narrow bed, backs against the wall. We were fond of each other, but we married because it made practical sense. His family knew mine, and we were both alone after the influenza took our parents. Preston nodded, understanding. Different kind of love, maybe, still real in its own way. Yes, Mary agreed, grateful for his perception. But different from, she hesitated, from what you feel now, Preston asked gently. Mary looked up at him, no longer afraid to reveal the truth in her eyes. Very different. As darkness fell, the temperatures plummeted again. They huddled together beneath Mary's quilts, their embrace chaste but intimate in its trust. Preston held her through the night, his strong arms keeping the cold and loneliness at bay more effectively than any fire. In the gray dawn light, Mary woke to find Preston already dressed and stoking the fire. I need to get back, he explained. Make sure the cattle survived the storm, Mary nodded, wrapping her quilt around herself as she rose. Of course, will I see you tomorrow? Preston crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Every morning until you tell me to stop coming. He hesitated, then added, and Mary, when spring comes and the pass is clear, would you consider making this arrangement more permanent? Her heart leapt. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Preston Mills? A smile broke across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Not doing a very good job of it, am I? What I mean to say is, I love you, Mary Sullivan, have almost from the first. And if you do me the honor of becoming my wife, I'd spend every day making sure you never wake cold or alone again. Mary threw her arms around his neck. Yes, she whispered against his ear. Yes, I will marry you. Their kiss was a promise, sealed in the golden light of morning. The remainder of winter passed in a blend of cold days and warm companionship. Preston continued bringing wood each morning, but now these visits were filled with plans for their future. He had been saving his wages, he told her, and had purchased a small parcel of land not far from her cabin. It's good grazing land, he explained one evening as they pored over a rough map he'd drawn. Could run our own small herd there, build something that's ours. Mary loved watching him speak of their future, his usual reserve giving way to enthusiasm. Could we plant an orchard too? She asked. I've always wanted apple trees. Anything you want, Preston promised. Though they say apple trees take patience, might be 5 years before we see a proper harvest. Mary squeezed his hand. I'm not going anywhere. In late February, Preston arrived one morning with a letter clutched in his hand, his expression troubled. What is it? Mary asked, immediately concerned. Mr. Walker's selling the ranch, he explained, sinking into a chair. His health's failing and his son wants to move him back east. The new owners take possession in April and they're bringing their own men. Mary's heart sank. So you'll lose your position, Preston nodded, staring at the letter. 8 years I've worked that land. What will you do? Mary asked softly. Preston looked up, determination replacing the momentary dejection. Move up our plans. I've saved enough for a modest start, 20 head of cattle and supplies to get us through till fall. If you're willing, we could marry before the month's end, combine what we have, and start building on my land right away. So soon, Mary's mind raced. But the cabin, my garden, your cabin sits on good land with the best water access, Preston pointed out. We could build our home here, use my land primarily for grazing. He took her hands. It won't be easy, Mary, starting a ranch from scratch never is, but together. Together, Mary repeated, the word filling her with courage. Yes, let's do it. Let's get married and build our ranch. They were married on the last Sunday in February in Summit Springs' small church. The ceremony was simple, attended by a few townspeople who had come to know Mary and some of Preston's fellow ranch hands. Mary wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that Preston said matched the winter sky with dried lavender tucked into her upswept hair. Preston looked almost uncomfortable in his clean shirt and polished boots, but his eyes never left Mary's face. Reverend Tompkins pronounced them husband and wife, just as the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending a shaft of golden light through the church's single-stained glass window. When Preston kissed her, Mary felt as though that light had somehow found its way inside her, warming her from within. Their wedding night was spent in Mary's cabin, now their cabin, where Preston had prepared a surprise. A proper bed frame, crafted by his own hands in secret hours at the ranch workshop, now replaced her simple pallet. The sturdy oak frame held a new feather mattress he'd purchased from the general store. So we start our life together with something that belongs to both of us, he explained as Mary ran her hands over the smooth wood, admiring the careful joinings and the wildflower patterns he'd carved into the headboard. It's beautiful, she whispered, overcome by the love evident in every detail. That night, they discovered each other with tenderness and growing passion. Preston's gentleness gave way to deeper need as Mary's own desire blossomed beneath his reverent touch. In the firelight, they came together as husband and wife, finding in each other's arms the connection both had secretly yearned for through years of solitude. Afterward, lying with her head on Preston's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Mary felt a completeness she hadn't known was possible. I love you, she murmured against his skin, his arms tightened around her. And I love you, Mrs. Mills. The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. She was no longer alone in the world. They had each other now, and together they would build something lasting. Spring arrived with sudden warmth that turned the snow-covered landscape into a muddy expanse almost overnight. Preston continued his work at the Walker Ranch until the new owners arrived, using his free time to begin clearing land for their expanded garden and the foundation of a barn. Mary threw herself into preparations as well, ordering seeds for planting and preserving every egg her 4 chickens produced to sell in town for extra cash. They would need every penny to establish their small ranch. In early April, Preston brought home their first cattle, 20 young heifers and a bull, purchased with nearly all of their combined savings. The animals were thin after the hard winter but healthy, their red coats beginning to shine in the strengthening sun. Herefords, Preston explained proudly as they watched the cattle explore their new pasture. Best breed for these mountains, hardy and good mothers. Mary slipped her arm around his waist. They're perfect. The work was endless and often exhausting. They rose before dawn each day, Preston tending the animals while Mary prepared breakfast and worked the garden. Their evenings were spent planning and building first the essential barn, then expanding the cabin to include a proper kitchen and second room. Some nights they fell into bed too tired even for conversation, merely holding each other as sleep claimed them. But there were other nights, especially after a milestone was reached, the barn roof finally in place. The first seeds sprouting in the garden when they celebrated their progress with passionate lovemaking that left them breathless and more deeply connected. By June, their small ranch was taking shape. Preston had cleared and fenced 10 acres of grazing land, and Mary's garden flourished with rows of potatoes, beans, corn, and squash. They had added 2 milk cows, a dozen more chickens, and a pair of sturdy workhorses to their growing operation. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, Preston reached for Mary's hand. "Are you happy, Mary? Truly?" She looked at him, surprised by the uncertainty in his voice. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." "Why do you ask?" Preston's eyes held a shadow of worry. "It's hard work, harder than it would have been if you'd married a shopkeeper or a doctor. Your hands weren't calloused when I met you." Mary laughed softly, raising her work-roughened palms. "I'm proud of these calluses. They show what we're building together." She leaned against his shoulder. "Are you happy, Preston?" His arm came around her, pulling her close. "I spent years thinking I'd live and die alone, that perhaps after what I'd seen in the war, I didn't deserve more. Then you came along with your fierce independence and your gentle heart, and suddenly I could see a future worth fighting for." Mary turned her face up to his. "That sounds like happiness to me." His kiss was her answer, long and sweet in the fading light. In July, Mary discovered she was expecting their first child. She shared the news with Preston one morning as they sat at breakfast, the eastern light streaming through the cabin windows. "A baby," Preston repeated, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "You're certain?" Mary nodded, suddenly anxious about his reaction. "Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday when I went to town. He says the baby should arrive in early February." Preston set down his cup and was around the table in 2 strides, lifting Mary from her chair and spinning her in a circle, his laughter filling the cabin. "A baby," he exclaimed, setting her gently back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Our baby." Relief and joy washed through Mary at his reaction. "You're pleased then?" "Pleased." Preston's eyes shone with emotion. "Mary, you've already given me more happiness than I ever thought possible, and now a child." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "I'll be the best father I can be, I promise you that." As summer turned to fall, Mary's body changed with her advancing pregnancy. Preston became even more protective, insisting on taking over the heavier garden work and hiring a local boy to help with chores she could no longer manage comfortably. "You're not to lift anything heavier than a teacup," he declared when she protested being treated like fragile china. "Doctor's orders." "Dr. Bennett said no such thing," Mary retorted, though she smiled at her husband's concern. "He said normal activity is perfectly fine." Preston remained unmoved. "Well, I'm saying it then. We've waited too long for this happiness to take any chances." Mary conceded, secretly touched by his devotion, and in truth, as the months passed, she was grateful for the help. Their ranch demanded constant attention, and the growing life within her sometimes left her exhausted by mid-afternoon. Autumn brought a bountiful harvest from Mary's garden. Together, they preserved hundreds of jars of vegetables, fruits, and jellies to see them through the coming winter. The cattle had thrived on the mountain grasses, nearly doubling in size, and 5 of the heifers were now carrying calves that would be born in the spring. "We've done well," Preston observed one evening as they inventoried their winter stores. "Better than I'd hoped for our first year." Mary smiled, running a hand over her swelling belly. "In more ways than one." As winter approached, Preston became obsessed with preparing for the cold. He spent weeks cutting and splitting wood, creating a stockpile large enough to heat 3 cabins through 2 winters. "I won't have you or the baby cold," he explained when Mary commented on the enormous woodpile. "Not ever." The first snow fell in early November, dusting the mountains with white that soon deepened into the familiar winter blanket. With the outdoor work largely finished for the season, Preston turned his attention to the cabin interior, building a cradle from seasoned pine and crafting shelves and cupboards to better organize their growing household. Mary occupied herself with sewing baby clothes and quilts, often reading aloud while Preston worked. They spent the long winter evenings planning for the coming year which fields to plant, how many cattle they might reasonably add to their herd, names for their expected child. "If it's a boy, perhaps we could name him after your brother," Mary suggested one night as they lay in bed, Preston's hand resting protectively over her rounded stomach. Preston was quiet for a long moment. "Thomas," he finally said. "His name was Thomas." "Thomas Mills," Mary tried the name aloud. "It's a good, strong name." "And if it's a girl?" Preston asked. Mary smiled in the darkness. "I was thinking Hope, because that's what she would be, a symbol of our hope for the future." "Thomas or Hope," Preston mused, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Either way, the luckiest child in Colorado." Christmas came, their first as husband and wife. They exchanged simple gifts: a new hat Mary had ordered secretly from the general store for Preston, and for her, a rocking chair he had crafted in the barn during stolen hours. "For nursing the baby," he explained as Mary ran her hands over the smooth, curved arms of the rocker, "and for telling stories when he or she is older." On New Year's Eve, a particularly fierce storm blew in, rattling the cabin's windows and howling down the chimney. Preston stoked the fire higher than usual, creating a cocoon of warmth inside their home. "Remember last winter?" Mary asked as they sat before the blazing hearth. "How cold this cabin used to get," Preston smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I remember a beautiful woman opening her door at dawn, looking like she might freeze solid if the wind blew any harder." "I nearly did, several times," Mary admitted, "before a certain cowboy started bringing me wood every morning." "Best decision I ever made," Preston said, his voice growing serious. Coming here that first morning, Mary leaned into him, feeling their child stir beneath her heart. "I think it was fate. We were meant to find each other." "Maybe so," Preston agreed. "Though I prefer to think it was good planning on my part. I saw you in town that day before, looking so determined despite everything, and I thought to myself, there's a woman who deserves better than to wake up cold." Mary laughed softly. "So it wasn't just neighborly concern." "Oh, there was concern," Preston admitted with a smile. "But there was also a fair amount of admiration from the start, and hope that you might eventually look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Mary kissed him then, pouring all her love into the gesture. "Thank you for the wood, Preston Mills, and for everything since." The baby arrived during a snowstorm on February 3, 1879, almost exactly a year after Preston had first appeared at Mary's door with an armload of firewood. After hours of labor attended by the midwife from town in Preston, who refused to leave her side despite the midwife's protests, Mary gave birth to a healthy daughter with a dusting of dark hair and her father's blue eyes. "Hope," Mary whispered as the tiny infant was placed in her arms. "Our hope." Preston sat beside them on the bed, his face showing wonder and a love so profound it brought tears to Mary's eyes. "She's perfect," he said, gently touching the baby's miniature fingers, "just like her mother." That night, as Mary dozed with Hope nestled against her chest, she woke briefly to find Preston adding wood to the fire, his movements as quiet as possible to avoid disturbing them. "Making sure we're warm enough," she murmured. Preston turned, his expression softening at the sight of his wife and daughter. "Always," he promised, coming to sit beside them. "It's what I do." Mary smiled sleepily. "You do so much more than that." In the quiet hours before dawn, as the storm outside began to abate and the first hint of approaching daylight colored the eastern sky, Mary reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the lonely widow facing an impossible winter to the wife and mother surrounded by love and security, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Preston had kept his promise. She never woke cold or alone. Instead, she woke each day to the warmth of his presence and the family they were building together, a far greater gift than mere firewood could ever provide. As the years passed, the Mills ranch prospered. Their herd grew to over 100 head, and their once small cabin expanded into a comfortable home. Hope was joined by two brothers, Thomas, born in 1881, and William, who arrived in 1883. The apple orchard Mary had dreamed of eventually bore fruit, just as Preston had predicted, 5 years after they planted the first saplings. On cold winter mornings, Preston still rose before dawn to stoke the fire, ensuring his family never felt the bite of Colorado's harsh climate. And each time, Mary would watch through half-lidded eyes as this man, her husband, her partner, her love, continued the ritual that had first brought them together. "You don't have to do that anymore, you know," she told him one morning, their 10th winter together. "I'm not alone now." Preston smiled, the firelight highlighting the silver now threaded through his beard. "Some habits are worth keeping," he said, settling back into bed beside her. "Besides, I made you a promise." Mary nestled against him, listening to the familiar sounds of their household, the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of their children in the next room, the distant lowing of cattle in the barn. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If you hadn't brought me wood that morning," Preston considered the question, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her arm. "I believe I would have found another reason to knock on your door," he finally said. "Some things are meant to be, Mary Mills. You and me, this family, this life we've built, it was always waiting for us to find it." Mary smiled, knowing he was right. Their love had begun with a simple act of kindness, wood brought to keep the cold at bay, but it had grown into something far more enduring. A warmth that neither winter nor hardship nor the passing of years could diminish. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding to the white blanket that covered their ranch. But inside, in the home they had built together, there was only warmth and the certainty that neither of them would ever wake cold or alone again.